I'm Daniëlla from FaceUp, and I am joined by Mary Shirley to discuss how organizations can strengthen their whistleblowing and investigations programs. Mary brings with her decades of ethics and compliance experience across regulators, in-house roles, private practice, and consultancy. And together, we will be looking at how companies can improve reporting processes, make better use of the data that they collect, and run investigations more consistently. By the end of this conversation, our hope is that you will leave with practical ideas that you can apply in your own compliance program. Before we jump into it, though, a quick word about FaceUp. Many organizations struggle to turn reports and investigations into a process that is clear, consistent, and credible. FaceUp helps companies manage whistleblowing, case handling, and investigations in a structured way so that issues can be addressed earlier and also more effectively, which I will say that it seems like the perfect balance for the conversation today with Mary. We will be taking questions throughout, so feel free to drop them also in the Q&A. We will be checking them throughout. If we don't have time to answer any questions live, we will get back to you afterwards, after the webinar is done. So, Mary, welcome. So happy to have you today.
Thank you so much, Danielle. It's nice to be here.
When we were prepping for the conversation and the topic today, we decided to split it into three parts. And this first one that we are going to focus on is a lot about encouraging employees to speak up. And it's interesting that employees often do not report any concerns or issues because they fear retaliation or because they think that nothing is going to happen after their report, so why bother? So let's focus first on what companies can do to reduce these barriers. In your opinion, what are the biggest barriers that prevent employees from ever raising concerns?
I think you've hit on them there. So from studies that we see consistently, fear of retaliation and the belief that it's futile or nothing will be done about it consistently rank in the highest spots. And I will say with one major exception, which is in the Nordic countries. So if you haven't yet come across the Nordic Business Ethics Initiative, they do an annual survey. It's been conducted since 2019. And interestingly, in that subsegment of the world, we see fear of retaliation typically much lower when it comes to fear. So if you're a global organization, I think it is tempting to focus quite heavily on fear of retaliation. But given that the belief that nothing will be done about it is also a major concern, and the fact that the Nordic countries don't fear retaliation as much, I think it makes a lot of sense to focus on both of those things at once in your campaigns and not just get caught up in, oh, I must deal with retaliation because that's the big gorilla, but considering that there are multiple factors that are probably being felt across your organization, and it's important to address all of those where you can.
Mm-hmm. And from the experience that you have over the years, what are some practical ways that companies can actually tackle these different issues or barriers?
Absolutely. I love low or no cost ways. So pretty much everything I'm going to mention today is likely to be free or at negligible cost. So the first idea that I'd like to share is around holding a two-pronged approach to talking about your investigation process. So the first angle is holding a session where you interview someone who is an investigator in the organization, and you give it a kind of sexy title that piques curiosity. So it might be something like investigations behind the scenes, or to use some more topical language of today, the compliance department spills the tea on the investigation process, that kind of thing. Or our lead investigator dishes the dirt on whatever, however you'd like to jazz that up for your audience. So you want to create some kind of intrigue around it. It's a voluntary opt-in session. It's not a mandatory training. And the idea of having the investigator there is the indirect messaging that it gives your colleagues that, whoa, there is actually a specially trained investigation staff member or team, as the case may be, who is here specifically to review my concerns. So that's the first positive messaging. And the second is to get very transparent and real about things that we don't tend to talk about in regard to investigations. And my only guess as to why that is because investigations by their very nature are it's inherently confidential, right? Like we think of them as being confidential because that's what we promise people. However, talking more broadly at a high level shouldn't be confidential, in my opinion. And I think it increases organizational trust when we're transparent. And so I like to use an FAQ section in this session after the interview that talks about really basic things like, so what actually happens during an investigation? And you may not need to do this by way of a training. So some companies have already incorporated this by way of their code of conduct. And if you haven't already reviewed the Hyatt Hotels code of conduct, around about pages 6 or 7, they talk about what people who speak up can be assured in the process, i.e. what promises do we make to you, and it sets expectations for the reporter. And this is quite an important one, I think. If you have a process whereby you do not guarantee that a reporter will receive the outcome of an investigation, which is very common in a lot of organizations, and from my perspective, I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. But a lot of people think by virtue of the fact that they've spoken up, that they are entitled to receive that information. And so being clear at the outset, such as within your code of conduct, and you can point to it later if folks try to ask, they don't get upset because it's not emotional or personal to do with them. It's simply how the process is. So setting those expectations in advance of, here's what we will give you, or we assure you, we promise you, and here are some of the things that we need to set your expectations on. But you may also choose to do that in this type of session. Folks may also ask questions around, or they're thinking about, well, I made a report about someone and they didn't get fired. So what happened? Like, are you not taking my report seriously? Are you favoring the subject of the investigation? And so using this process to be transparent and head off this issue before hopefully it even happens is to go into detail around situations in which it may be possible that the report was thoroughly investigated, but for whatever reason, a disciplinary action or negative consequences were not visible externally. So that type of messaging around, hey, we have a dedicated function, specially trained people to do this, coupled with transparency, openness, and honesty about what you can reasonably expect and what you can reasonably not expect, I think is helpful to our employees to foster organizational trust in the speak up process.
Love these ideas. And the one that you mentioned regarding the FAQ and setting the expectations already in the code of conduct, this is something that we are speaking a lot about with our customers because it is important to set these expectations from the get-go. But I absolutely love the idea of the session with the investigator. Of course, I think that this also is in the end for companies that might be a little bit bigger and that have this dedicated person. But the spill the tea type of conversation, and that it's not mandatory, I think that can be really useful. People are curious, so that will definitely be of help, I believe.
Yes.
Um,
And if I could add,
yes.
even if there's not a dedicated investigator, and I've certainly worked at my fair share of organizations that are small to medium size, and I don't want you to feel left out if you're listening right now. It doesn't have to be someone with an investigator title, right? Just a person who is doing a lot of investigations in their role. Maybe worth even thinking on whether from an HR standpoint you'd want to include an HR investigator as well to sort of cover off the compliance angle as well as an HR angle.
Mhm. We do have a question or two coming up about the HR and compliance angle,
Mm-hmm.
so I will leave it for that, but that is a very good point. And again, for anyone who is listening, if you have specific questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. If we don't have time to get to them because we do have quite a bit to cover, we will get back to you after the webinar. Now, you mentioned some of these initiatives that companies can have. What do you think about preparing managers for these difficult conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a part that we often overlook, to be honest. So, most organizations, regardless of size, is typically going to have a speak up avenue, which includes an independent hotline like yours at FaceUp, or being able to speak to the compliance department, HR, legal, executive leadership, the board, or your very own manager. And we know a lot of people tend to take up that route, especially when they have a good relationship with their manager. What we often fail to do is train managers on what to do when that happens. So we tell people that they should do it, and then we forget to properly equip managers with what they need to do to take the baton and pass it on. So I like to hold a session that is specifically for managers on how to receive reports. And the unspoken part of that is and also how we're going to have you minimize our risks of retaliation, because frankly, managers are one of the highest exposed areas to the folks that may dish out retaliation. The interesting twist that I like to have on this training, again, not mandatory, voluntary opt-in to not have people feel forced into it. Adult learning theory, letting them have the freedom and autonomy to be interested in and take part in it, is to invite everybody in the organization. So it's labeled for managers, but it's open to everyone. And there are a number of benefits to doing it this way. The first is that our independent contributors are our leaders of tomorrow, and it's never too early to start equipping them with leadership skills and the knowledge required to do that job. The second is that I really want everybody in the company to see our leaders being held accountable to the standards that we want to reinforce and our values around speaking up. And the third is that I want everybody to get a refresher on what retaliation is, because I don't think you can train on that really or get that message out too much. And I think the fact that it's for managers, but you're not a manager, often piques that curiosity in the colleagues of, oh, this is for leadership. I'm allowed to come. I'm gonna come because it's not really specifically for me. So I'm going to jump in anyway. And so during that session, it's not even that long in terms of what you need to talk about. I tend to run mine as do's and don'ts for leaders. And it's really basic things like treat the employee as you've always done. Don't try to investigate yourself. Obviously, having that in a methodical deck that you can present and take questions from the group as well. And if you didn't do the earlier idea that we spoke about that session, it's an opportunity to bring in some of those frequently asked questions. And a really critical one for this type of audience or focus is, I'm a leader who is performance managing an employee and they speak up about an issue. Do I have to stop performance managing them because it might look like retaliation? So making sure that you address that type of thing head on. And of course, the response to that is usually going to be something along the lines of, if you're performance managing them for a good cause and you've been documenting that before they spoke up, you're likely to be able to continue on with that process. However, because it's a sensitive topic, loop in HR and compliance. We'll obviously bring in legal if we need to, and follow basically the instructions. Speaking up is not an all-encompassing protection from negative consequences that may happen to you for all sorts of reasons in the organization, such as you being a terrible employee. And I think actually having colleagues hear that and go, oh, I thought that was a really good loophole that I could rely on when I start slacking off, and hearing that in actual fact it's not carte blanche to go do whatever you want. If you just simply make an allegation, it protects you forever. Simply not the case. It does add some complexity though, and that's why it's important to have folks know about the fact that they can bring in advisory from other departments such as compliance to help them. But I think it's important not only for the managers to be reassured in the situation, but for there to be some education to the colleagues who may not be our most ethical, who are thinking about abusing the speak up process and using it as a vehicle for their own personal gain.
Mhm. Those are very, very valid points. And I think that for managers, if they don't have this, I will call it support system, it might
Mm-hmm.
feel like walking on ice, which
Yeah,
is never a good feeling. Um,
right.
you already touched on quite a few points, but is there something that you would add on top of what you've said so far about how companies can help make employees feel safe about
Mhm.
reporting?
So I think the major thing that I learned later than I would have liked is often when it comes to wanting to create a safe environment, I've often heavily relied on, oh, I'll just keep repeating the fact that we have zero tolerance for retaliation and that we encourage speaking up. What I have found is more effective is actually going to employees and saying, what do you think would make you feel safer about the speak up process? And actually, the response is not, Mary, I'd love to hear you tell me for the millionth time that we have a zero tolerance policy against retaliation. What they actually say or tend to say, and this might differ in your organization, I encourage you to give it a go yourself if you haven't already, is I want to hear about what happened to someone who spoke up. They want to get reassured that when someone spoke up, they still had a successful life and career at the organization afterwards, that they're still here, that they're still satisfied and comfortable in their role. So, where you can look to get that kind of reassurance and not just assume out of your own mind, oh, I'm just going to talk about retaliation for the zillionth time, try asking the actual stakeholders themselves, what more could we be doing?
Love it. And for the customers of FaceUp that know me, this is something that I hammer down a little bit on. I even invite them to do a survey now when they're launching to see what do employees say, how do they feel, and then do it again in 6 months and do it again
Yes.
afterwards to see how we need to tweak
Mhm.
anything. So absolutely agree. We need to hear it from them and see where we can make some adjustments.
Mhm.
If a company puts these things in practice, I would assume that it would build a high trust culture in reporting. How do you see from your experience, how does that high trust culture actually look in practice?
Yeah, I think there are some data points that we can look to. So by and large, we consider the less anonymized reports that are being made, the better. And of course, you can look at benchmarking surveys to see what is an approximate one. For me personally, I tend to think if my scores of anonymity, if they go over 50%, that's when I would start to get nervous that more often than not, people are masking their identity. So that's a problematic indicator. I think you want to have the more identity revealed, folks coming to you directly or giving their name to the hotline call intake receiver are the better signs when it comes to organizational trust. I also think retaliation, substantiated retaliation and perceived retaliation, so number of reports about retaliation, and also look at the number of actual substantiated retaliation cases. Those data points typically help us to identify whether there's a good culture of integrity in the organization. So I would tend to look at those as my starting point, and ideally look to see if there's improvement trending downwards over time.
Hmm. And I think that this is a great transition to our next section, which is all about data and how we can use it to improve the programs that we have in place. And as we were preparing for this, I think that one thing that we all agree on is that reporting data is more than just a compliance metric, and that it's actually very key for business success to understand
Mm-hmm.
trust and risk and
Mm-hmm.
the health of how a company operates. There is an interesting data that you already touched on a little bit before, but it seems that of employees who do report, that only 27% of them saw their employer take any meaningful action about the report that they made. And for some, this might sound like a process failure,
Mm-hmm.
and then also leads to failing trust in the company. How can compliance teams use data to fill or close the gap? And what might actually mean this, that only a certain number of employees saw any meaningful action?
Yeah, so I can understand for the employee in that situation why that might feel incredibly disheartening, why they might have a perception that their report wasn't taken seriously, or perhaps that it wasn't investigated thoroughly enough. And that's why I like to cover off this type of thing in the transparency exercise that I mentioned earlier, because I think there are multiple situations in which you might not see or believe that there has been a fix, if you will, to your report, when in actual fact, there's a really good reason for that behind the scenes. And so if I were addressing that question in a session, there are typically two situations in which I see that occur the most. When you, for example, like I spoke up about someone, why are they still with the company? The first reason is that the investigation may have been conducted thoroughly, and even the investigator may be feeling in their gut, deep down inside, wow, I'm pretty sure this did happen, but there is no proof or evidence to substantiate the investigation, or it's insufficient to conclusively substantiate the investigation, and therefore it must be closed. And that's always a bad feeling for the investigator. But it also means, I think, in that situation, the investigator typically does more than they usually would to make sure that they have chased down all leads and conducted the investigation thoroughly. So that's one situation. And I think we would agree that that's probably natural justice and due process working. That if I had an investigation, an allegation leveled against me, and there wasn't evidence to prove that I'd actually done it, and then the investigation said, "Yep, she's bad. Like this, she's guilty." That would feel super uncomfortable. I don't think anyone actually wants that happening in practice. The second situation is one where, in fact, the allegation was substantiated and there was disciplinary action. However, it wasn't visible externally. So that might be things like a formal warning letter was issued. The person was withheld from a promotion they were up for. They became ineligible for their bonus. They received a less than satisfactory performance review this year because of it. All of those things are items that we would not expect to see placed on the company intranet advertising this person's downfall. So it's simply the case that sometimes, quite appropriate, consequences have occurred, and not everything should, I think, result in termination. We need to be proportionate about these things. We're supposed to have risk-based and proportionate compliance programs. That should apply to disciplinary action and consequences and investigations as well. So that's why I think it's really important to figure out what it is that really upsets people, like what's causing them concern about the process, and then directly talking about the elephant in the room head on during your sessions when you can.
Hmm.
So your question was around data. And I think that particular example shows us that we can't necessarily get too caught up in certain pieces of data in isolation. We use it to the best that we can, but I don't think we should let it get us bogged down and heading down rabbit holes, worried about things where there could be other justifications. I think we should use data to the extent that we can, and the anonymity reporting rate is one area. Another area that I think is critical is the number of reports being received per 100 employees. And a little tip that I would give there is to make sure that the individual who is in charge of these statistics and reporting actually knows how to do the calculation, so that you're reporting the correct figures to the board. That can be an area where folks slip up, and you think you're comparing apples with benchmark data, and in fact you're not. And that's embarrassing to have to backpedal on and rectify.
Completely agree. And you already mentioned some metrics that are important, but you also mentioned, and I think some people might forget, is that metrics and data should not be looked at in isolation. There might always be another side to it. We also need to analyze the qualitative data, some of that you already mentioned as well. So in your experience and in your work, how can people, companies avoid overinterpreting data in isolation, only looking at metrics or only looking at qualitative analysis? How can they balance this?
Yeah, I think that's always going to be a risk with data analytics. And people often say that you can basically make data say whatever you want it to. What I've done to try and avoid this, but also this activity helps decrease working in silos in an organization. I've pulled together my entire compliance department and shown them the quarterly data that before I report it to the board, and ask them to take a look and tell me what's interesting to you. And the important, I think, part about that activity for when it comes to your question is that we're not just stuck by my biases and my limitations, that everybody in the department gets to look at it together with their own unique perspectives and diversity of opinion and provide some commentary into that analysis. And it helps me to see things that I wouldn't otherwise have seen. So I think when there are lots of different people commenting on things, that helps you to focus in on what really matters and potentially what the important data really is. And then it's got that lovely additional benefit of bringing the team together so that folks who may not have investigation specific roles, so in the larger organizations, perhaps you have a policy management lead, that individual then gets to weigh in and have their expertise incorporated into the data analytics process.
Very good tips. It's a tricky job to manage. It's a lot of nuances, I will say. Our next question is regarding the USA in particular. So I'm actually going to read this so that I don't get it wrong. The U.S. Department of Justice has referenced transparency as part of the reporting program expectations. How can companies actually apply this practically?
Yeah. So what's interesting about that requirement or that expectation or a little nudge is that I think it came in the 2023 guidance or maybe the one just before. But it referenced a tactic that many folks have actually been doing for years now. And it's an idea that executives either love or they hate. But I think it's worth proposing it, even if your leader is not fond of it. So the idea essentially is to take anonymized and sanitized real cases that you've had in your organization and walk through the scenario, what happened, and if you feel it's appropriate, any of the consequences. And sometimes consequences are not necessarily this executive got fired, but rather we realized that we had a gap in policy, and so we had to adjust it and close out a loophole or whatever it is accordingly. The reason why I think some executives don't love this is that they feel like it's airing their dirty laundry. However, what I will say is that in every organization where folks have actually deployed this tactic, it has been really successful, heavily embraced. And there's one organization I remember it was presented about at a conference that I attended actually, and they created a page on the intranet called The Dark Alley. And it became the the number two most visited intranet site, only coming runner up to the site you go to get your expenses reimbursed. So that tells you just how, I mean, it was just after money. That's how popular that page was. So it's something to consider. And if you have a management team that's a little bit reticent about it, you can bolster it with the fact that it's now in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs guidance issued by DOJ. So that can be a helpful nudge in that direction. I think that type of thing is incredibly helpful. And along those lines, something similar that I've done is with annual training, doing a scenario-based training to bring real situations to colleagues, and then using like a law and order SVU caveat at the beginning of the training, which says something along the lines of, all characters and scenarios in this training are entirely true if they bear any resemblance to persons that you know. This may be for good reason, whatever you want to say to kind of really bring home to colleagues the training you're about to attend is not based on catastrophizing by the compliance department. These are unfortunately ridiculous scenarios that we have had to deal with and fix over the last year, and we're bringing them to you so that we don't make the same mistake again.
Who would have thought that compliance can be so lively? There's a lot going on there.
Yes.
You mentioned that for the first idea of sharing examples and how it was dealt, that sometimes executives either love it or hate it. I see in the work that I'm doing with our customers that a lot of the culture does trickle down from the top. What trends have you seen in businesses that have a very healthy reporting culture versus those that don't?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a statistically significant sample based on what I've seen, but I think it is not uncommon in companies where there isn't much speaking up for employees to be a little miserable and disengaged generally. That's not to say that in companies where there is a healthy amount of speaking up that everybody's happy and they have nothing to complain about, because obviously they complain about something if they've got the reports at a decent rate. But I wouldn't be surprised if this was to be studied, that in organizations where speaking up was not the norm, if employees were a little bit miserable at work.
And miserable employees are not the most productive employees.
Exactly.
So we are going to enter our third and final section, and it is all about quality and ongoing monitoring of investigations. And I think you have touched a little bit on this already throughout our conversation, but a good reporting program depends not only on receiving these concerns or these reports, but also on how they are consistently and fairly investigated. What should compliance leaders be monitoring to know whether their investigations are being handled effectively and fairly?
Mm-hmm. So one of the again, a pretty traditional exercise that I think has been around a long time is mystery shopping your compliance hotline provider like FaceUp, giving a call or submitting a web submission, or if you use an email that's related to your hotline provider. I traditionally haven't, so I'm not sure if that's the norm, but whatever you have with your hotline provider, put in a fake allegation and see how it goes. And so you will be looking at things like how long did it take for the hotline provider to answer the phone? Abandonment rates are, I think, a relatively important data point that you should be looking at as to whether folks can have trust in your process. You want people to be picking up pretty promptly. You don't want people to be giving up, hanging up the phone, and taking their report away with them. The customer service angle. So how reassuring are they? Are they easy to speak with? Are they clear? Are they asking good questions to solicit information for the report? I have a broader mystery shopping resource, a checklist, which FaceUp is able to share with any attendees who would like a copy of it. So there is a section on Speak Up, just as we've covered now, but it's also broader for other elements of your compliance program as well, if you'd like to give that a broader review. But those are the types of things that I would start with.
And so this touches very much the reporting experience and how that looks like for an employee
Mm-hmm.
or even anyone else that
Mm-hmm.
is using it. And what should companies be looking at after that report come in? Like,
Yeah.
is there an investigation? Is there not? How can they assess that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I like to do is hold a peer norming activity with the investigators and the team. And if anybody is in a smaller company, don't worry, I have an idea for you as well. If you don't have a specific investigation team, you can run this function, this exercise with other assurance functions in your organizations, like internal audit, like HR, and swap your data to have a look. So take a sample of randomly selected investigation data and review each other's. So you're going to want to be looking for adequate record keeping and documentation. Does the outcome make sense in light of the information that's been recorded? This is also a peer nudge activity for your members of the team, and that would be me, who are not the most detail oriented folks and are more high level. We tend to not write the most comprehensive notes. We might write a few sentences opposed to paragraphs on end. When those folks see the more in-depth documentation of other colleagues, it nudges them to up their game and become more like the average. So when we only ever see our own documentation or do things our own way, it means that we're in our own little echo chamber, and having the insight into some of the best practices of other folks helps our colleagues learn from it in a way where they're self-learning. Like, we're not didactically telling them, you need to fix this or improve this. They're realizing in real time, oh, yikes, I probably, if this were my investigation report, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as good. So this exchange and sharing of documentation, obviously on a limited basis, to just do samples, can be really helpful in ensuring consistency. Another angle or another initiative that I like to do is an investigation template, which includes prompts, again, for some of those folks like me who may not necessarily love all the detail and get into the weeds all the time, so that there's a minimum level of information that is extracted and produced for the record in each investigation. And if compliance creates one of these, it can be a gesture of goodwill to share these with other investigation functions in your organization to see if they would like to use or adapt the tool for themselves. So that might be HR, legal, if you're in a healthcare system, the clinical quality investigators as well. Share those resources, and for you, it's a really good way to have consistency and a little bit of quality assurance throughout the department.
Mm-hmm. And then this will all lead to metrics that the compliance leaders are probably looking at. So, what is the consistency of the process? What is the quality of the documentation? Even the reporter experience
Yeah.
after submitting the case and having it investigated, or even the investigation completion time. So, everything you've mentioned will impact somehow these metrics as well.
Yes. And another thing to bear in mind, like sometimes when we do these initiatives, we think, oh man, the team's probably going to be annoyed with me because I'm asking them to do more work. interestingly, after I implemented this exercise at a former employer, the investigators enjoyed it so much. We did a debrief session afterwards to talk about some of the trends that we identified and things that we'd learned. And the investigators liked it so much, they asked me if we could do it quarterly. So sometimes it's surprising what the compliance team members as well, it may feel like extra work, but if it's value add work, folks are going to want to do it for the, for the value it brings to the investigation process and your team.
And it all sounds like things that will actually, it might seem like added workload at the start, but that it also will impact the quality of their work. So
Yeah.
probably they will be more motivated to do it as well. We have a few final questions, Mary, if you don't mind
Yep,
bearing with
of
me.
course.
I did mention at the start that we wanted to look at the intersection of HR and legal, compliance, management. Where should ownership sit when a concern touches these multiple functions? Because I see this a lot in my day-to-day. We have HR, we have legal, compliance. Where is the ownership?
I don't think there's any specific only one answer for this question. I will tell you that what has tended to work for me in organizations is assigning or being aware of the point of contact in each relevant department, and us going off to investigate our own areas and then coming back for debrief sessions to share what we've learned so far in the process. There may also be some utility in collaborating on joint interviews if necessary, especially if travel is involved. I've traveled out to places with investigators from other departments and covered things off in person in one go. But for the remote ones where that may not be as necessary, making sure everybody's clear on their scope for the investigation and understanding when we're going to come back and talk. I do find that it tends to be the case that compliance often ends up being the de facto leader of the pack, if you will. We're often the ones who are setting up that meeting, hustling the others in terms of, have you done your interviews yet? Are you ready to meet? That kind of thing. I think that's largely okay. I like being seen as the department that gets stuff done. So hopefully that's a positive. And I think if you're in that situation too, it's not unusual. I think we're known for that, and that's a positive reputation to have.
You've given quite a lot of tips and advice throughout our conversation. And for some of our listeners, it might almost seem overwhelming, like, where do I start? So if the team or a company could improve only one thing or focus on one thing over the next 6 to 12 months, where would you advise them to start?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on your maturity and what you've already achieved. So I won't give a specific milestone item to think on. But what I would say is check yourself. So no matter where you're at, how mature or immature you are at in your process, ask when was the last time I checked in with my constituents about how we're going in this process. One of the easy ways in which you can do this is incorporating it into your compliance week activities. So in some organizations, I think it's common to get survey fatigue. And, you don't want to be issuing surveys all the time in compliance to have more work for people to get on top of. But Compliance Week, I think, is a special little hack or a loophole where people are literally lining up to participate in our activities to win prizes. So why not use that to our advantage? I think too often folks see Compliance Week as just that one-way street of us pushing out information. I see it as being a two-way street opportunity to get some information that's important for us as well. So you might like to ask some questions in that in your activities, in your games that hit on certain things depending on where you're at in your program. So for example, if you are not sure that people know how to even access hotline details, how do we call the FaceUp number that we have, asking them that in a question, making it part of a scavenger hunt exercise to actually tell you what the number is, so they have to go hunt around and look for it. If you have questions around whether people know that they can speak up to their manager, incorporate that. If they understand what to do if they feel that they've been retaliated against, do that. So you can use your compliance week as a tool, but my overarching response is wherever you're at in your program, I think it's really important to make sure that we understand where it's landing. Our colleagues are our internal customers, and if we're only doing things unilaterally without consulting with them early, without getting their perspective and feedback, we're really doing ourselves a disservice. And that directly impacts what they think, directly impacts where you should go next and what you should do next.
I love that you positioned it this way. It's getting information and input in order to be able to do something about it. Yes, our colleagues are our internal clients, let's say. Mary, it was an absolute pleasure to have you today. You have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. So thank you so much for sharing your feedback and insights with us.
My pleasure.
For you that were listening to us, we trust that this was a helpful conversation and that it has given everyone a clearer sense of how to build more trust in reporting, make better use of data, and also to strengthen the quality of the investigations that you might be running across your organization. And if these are challenges that your team is currently working through, we'd be happy to continue the conversation. You can feel free to reach out to us at the FaceUp team to discuss your reporting and your investigations program in more detail, and we'll be happy to give you some input. Thank you everyone for joining, and Mary, thank you again so much for your insights.